The storm arrived without warning, as most disasters do. Rain hammered against the ancient stones of Thornwood Fortress like 1,000 desperate fists, wind howling through the mountain peaks with voices that sounded almost human. Inside the great hall, Alaric Thornwood sat alone before a fireplace large enough to roast an entire elk, flames casting shadows that danced across walls hung with tapestries, depicting 3 centuries of victories. Each thread told a story of battles won, enemies vanquished, a kingdom forged through blood and iron will. They were beautiful in their brutality, and Alaric had stopped looking at them decades ago. He knew every scene by heart, could recite the death toll of each conquest without hesitation. Glory, they called it. Isolation. He knew it to be. The sound came so suddenly that at first he thought he'd imagined it. 3 sharp knocks against the fortress's main door, barely audible above the storm's fury. Alaric's head snapped toward the knee. Entrance, golden eyes narrowing. No one came to Thornwood Fortress. Not ambassadors, not supplicants, not even the bravest warriors seeking to test themselves against the legendary king. The last person to knock on that door had been a messenger 47 years ago, and even he had trembled so violently that his parchment had fallen from shaking hands. Alaric rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, his 7-foot frame unfolding like a shadow-given substance. Perhaps it was an animal seeking shelter, or debris thrown by wind. But then the knocks came again, weaker this time and unmistakably deliberate. He crossed the hall in long strides, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The fortress had rooms for hundreds, but Alaric lived here alone, had lived alone for longer than most wolves could comprehend. Servants came once a month to deliver supplies and leave them at the outer gates, never daring to venture further. Even his council met with him in the neutral territory of Silver Peak City. Unwilling to enter what they whispered was a cursed place. Let them whisper, Alaric thought, as he reached the massive oak doors bound in iron. Their fear kept them safe from knowing what 300 years of leadership truly cost. He pulled the door open, ready to face whatever storm-driven curiosity had brought something to his threshold. Instead, he found her, a girl, barely more than a whisper of a presence, collapsed against the doorframe with rain plastering, dark hair to her face and trembling fingers still raised as if to knock again. She wore what had once been a simple dress, now torn and mud-stained, and her feet were bare, bleeding from what must have been miles of desperate flight through the mountain forests. But it was her scent that struck him like a physical blow, that unmistakable sweetness of an omega in distress, mixed with something else, something that made his ancient wolf stir with recognition. She looked up at him with eyes the color of spring moss, and instead of screaming or fainting as he expected, she whispered 2 words that invoked the oldest law of their kind, right of sanctuary. Before you continue with this story, I need to pause and invite you to join our community. If you're enjoying these tales of supernatural romance and unlikely connections, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like Alaric and Mira's to life, and I promise you, what's coming next will exceed every expectation. Drop a comment telling me what you think of our legendary Alpha King so far. Now, let's see what happens when an ancient ruler faces the one thing his power cannot control. Alaric stared at the girl for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The right of sanctuary was indeed the oldest law, predating even his own considerable lifetime, rooted in the very foundation of werewolf society. Any wolf who reached an alpha's door and spoke those words could not be turned away for 3 nights, no matter what crimes they'd committed or who pursued them. It was a sacred trust, one that even the feared King of Shadows could not violate without bringing the wrath of every pack in the realm upon himself. He had granted sanctuary perhaps 5 times in 3 centuries, and each time the supplicant had fled, screaming before the first night ended, unable to bear his presence. This slip of a girl would likely do the same, but the law was the law. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She stumbled across the threshold and immediately collapsed, her legs finally giving out after whatever ordeal had driven her to his door. Alaric caught her before she hit the stone floor, his hands steady despite the jolt that ran through him at the contact. Her skin was ice cold, her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird's wings. She was moments from shock, her body shutting down from exhaustion and exposure. He lifted her easily, her weight nothing in his arms, and carried her toward the fire. As he laid her on the ancient bearskin rug before the hearth, she stirred slightly, consciousness flickering. Her hand reached out, grasping his wrist with surprising strength, and then everything changed. The vision hit him like a tidal wave, memories that were not his own flooding through their point of contact. He saw through her eyes, felt through her skin. A small village pack, traditional and rigid. An alpha named Cormac, brutal and entitled, who had decided she would be his bride despite her protests. The binding ceremony being prepared against her will, her own family complicit, trading their daughter for political favor. The moment she'd decided to run, stealing away in the night with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a desperate hope that the old stories were true, that the king in the mountain might grant sanctuary, even to someone as insignificant as her. The journey through the forest, terror and determination warring with each, exhaustion heavy step, the certain knowledge that if Cormac caught her, death would be a mercy compared to what awaited. Alaric jerked his hand away, breaking the connection, his breath coming harder than it had in centuries. She released him and slumped back unconscious. But the damage was done. He'd seen it all, felt it all, experienced her desperate flight as if it were his own memory. More than that, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was, the faint pull of recognition, like a compass needle swinging toward true north. This girl, this terrified Omega seeking shelter from a forced bond, carried something within her that called to something within him. Impossible, his mind insisted, but his wolf, that primal part of him that predated reason, knew better. He spent the next hour in practical motions, pushing aside the implications of what he'd experienced. He fetched warm water and cloths, cleaned and bandaged her torn feet with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation. He wrapped her in furs and positioned her close to the fire, checking her temperature and heartbeat with the clinical efficiency of someone who had tended many wounded over many years. She slept deeply, her body surrendering to exhaustion now that it had found safety. Alaric settled into his chair and watched her, his mind racing through possibilities and problems. If she had fled from an alpha's claim, that alpha would pursue. The right of sanctuary protected her for 3 nights, but after that, law became complicated. And if his instincts were correct about what he'd felt during that moment of contact, complications were the least of what was coming. She woke near dawn, consciousness returning in stages. First confusion, then memory, then wariness as she registered the massive figure seated nearby watching her with eyes that glowed faintly in the firelight. Alaric remained perfectly still, letting her orient herself, giving her space to process. Most wolves found his presence overwhelming, the weight of his power pressing against them like a physical thing. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing as her bandaged feet shifted, and met his gaze with a directness that surprised him. Fear was there, certainly, but also determination, and something else he couldn't quite name. She cleared her throat, her voice rough from screaming during her flight through the forest. "Thank you for honoring sanctuary," she said. "I know my presence here is an imposition. I'll be gone the moment the 3 nights end." Alaric leaned forward slightly, his expression neutral. "Before we discuss your departure, perhaps you should tell me your name and explain exactly what you did to me when you touched my hand. That was no ordinary contact." He kept his voice even, not accusing, simply stating fact. She blinked, confusion crossing her features before understanding dawned. Her face paled, and she pulled her hands against her chest as if they had betrayed her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. It happens sometimes when I'm stressed or frightened. I see things, memories, pieces of people's pasts. My grandmother called it the oracle's touch, said it ran in our bloodline, but I've always tried to hide it. Most wolves consider it an invasion, a violation of privacy." He nodded slowly. pieces falling into place. Oracle wolves were legends, supposedly extinct for centuries, seers who could read the past. Through touch and sometimes glimpse threads of future possibility, they had been revered and feared in equal measure, their gifts making them targets during the great purges that had swept through werewolf society generations ago. If this girl carried even a fraction of that ancient bloodline, she was far more than a simple Omega fleeing an unwanted bond. She was a treasure and a danger, a key to secrets that many would kill to possess or destroy. No wonder she'd learned to hide her gift. No wonder she'd run rather than let herself be claimed by an alpha who would inevitably use her abilities for his own gain. "Your name," he prompted gently. She hesitated, then lifted her chin with a courage he found himself respecting. "Mira Ashford, of the Clearwater Pack," she said. "Or I was, until I left. I claim no pack now. I ask only for the sanctuary the old laws promise, 3 nights to rest and heal before I continue running." She said it matter-of-factly, already resigned to a life of flight, of always looking over her shoulder. Alaric felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he'd thought long dead. This girl, this small, brave Omega with ancient gifts flowing through her veins, had knocked on the door of the most feared wolf alive and was already planning her next escape. Certain that nowhere could truly be safe for someone like her, he stood, his full height emphasizing the difference between them, and saw her fight not to flinch. "Mira Ashford," he said, his deep voice formal. I am Alaric Thornwood, and while you shelter under my roof, you are under my protection. The right of sanctuary grants you 3 nights, yes, but it does not require you to leave on the 4th morning if you do not wish to. This fortress has stood empty for too long. If you choose to remain beyond the allotted time, you would be welcome." He watched the shock spread across her face, followed by disbelief. She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued. "However, I suspect the alpha you fled will not accept your disappearance easily. Tell me about Cormac of Clearwater. What manner of wolf is he, and how far will he pursue?" The mention of that name made her shudder. "Cormac is ambitious and cruel," she said quietly. "He's the Pack Alpha's nephew, protected by family ties despite his brutality. He decided I would be his mate not because of any bond or affection, but because my family's bloodline is old, and he believes it will legitimize his own standing. When I refused, he convinced my father that a union would benefit everyone. My father agreed, and suddenly I had no choice. The ceremony was planned for the new moon, just 3 days away." She pulled the furs tighter around herself. "He'll pursue me to the ends of the earth, not because he cares about me, but because I defied him. To him, I'm property that escaped, and his pride demands my return." Alaric's jaw tightened, ancient anger stirring. He had encountered many Cormacs over his long life, entitled wolves who believed power gave them the right to take whatever they desired. He had executed several of them, disbanded their packs, scattered their supporters. But he had also learned that destroying one just made room for another to rise. The problem was not individual wolves, but the culture that enabled them, the acceptance of forced bonds as normal, the treatment of Omegas as possessions rather than people. It was one of many reasons his own kind whispered about him in fear. His laws were harsh, his punishments severe, and he had no patience for those who abused the vulnerable. But fear only controlled behavior, never changed hearts, and his isolation meant his influence only reached so far. Before we continue unraveling the layers of Alaric and Mira's impossible situation, I want to remind you that stories like these thrive on your engagement. If you're curious about where this connection will lead, if you want to see how a 300-year-old king handles protecting someone who makes him feel again, then please consider subscribing. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens when Cormac comes knocking. Trust me, the confrontation ahead will change everything. Now, back to our story. The next 2 days passed in a strange rhythm that neither Alaric nor Mira could have anticipated. She recovered her strength gradually, her youth and wolf healing accelerating the process, though her feet remained tender and bandaged. He provided her with proper clothing from storage rooms filled with items from different eras, finding garments that fit well enough. She explored the fortress tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, discovering rooms that hadn't seen occupation in decades, libraries filled with books in languages both modern and ancient, an armory that could outfit a small army, gardens long overgrown but still beautiful in their wildness. Thornwood Fortress was vast, a monument to power and loneliness in equal measure. What surprised them both was how easily they fell into each other's company. Alaric had expected awkwardness, the usual fear and stammering that accompanied any interaction with other wolves. Instead, Mira treated him with a cautious respect that somehow lacked the paralyzing terror he'd grown accustomed to. Perhaps having glimpsed his memories during that first touch had immunized her to the legend, letting her see the complicated reality beneath. She asked him questions over meals, genuine curiosity about his long life, his experiences, the weight of leading for centuries. He found himself answering with a candor that surprised him, speaking truths he'd never voiced to anyone. His council saw him as a weapon to be aimed at threats. His subjects saw him as a shield that kept them safe. But Mira, somehow, seemed to see him as simply Alaric. For her part, Mira felt the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack. She'd spent years hiding her gifts, making herself small and unremarkable, trying to survive in a pack that valued her only for her bloodline and her potential usefulness. Cormac had wanted to own her abilities, to use her oracle's touch to gain advantage over rivals and foresee threats. Her family had been willing to sell her to secure their position. She'd learned to trust no one, to keep everyone at arm's length. But here, in this fortress of stone and shadow, with a king who was himself an exile of sorts, she found an unexpected freedom. He asked nothing of her, demanded nothing, simply offered safety and space to breathe. It was terrifying how quickly that began to feel like something more than temporary shelter. On the evening of the second night, they sat together in the library, the room lit by dozens of candles Mira had found and placed around the space. She was curled in a massive leather chair, a book of ancient legends open in her lap, while Alaric stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit mountains. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that only exists between people who've begun to trust each other. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Can I ask you something that might offend you?" He turned, one eyebrow raised, and gestured for her to continue. She took a breath. "The stories say you're a monster, a king without mercy who's killed thousands. But in the 300 years, you must have also saved countless lives, made decisions that protected your people even when those decisions cost you everything. Why do you let them only remember the blood? Why not defend yourself? Tell your side of the story?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her, his large frame somehow managing to look weary despite his obvious strength. "Because the blood is real, Mira," he said finally. "I have killed thousands, made choices that sent wolves to their deaths, destroyed packs that threatened the peace, executed alphas who abused their power, waged wars that saved. Millions, but cost dearly in the doing. The stories are not wrong about what I've done." He leaned forward, his golden eyes intense. "But you're right that they don't tell the full truth. Every death weighs on me. Every sacrifice haunts my sleep even now. I let them call me monster, because it's easier than explaining that sometimes there are no good choices. Only terrible ones, and worse ones. And because if they fear me enough, they think twice before forcing me to become the thing they accuse me of being." She set her book aside and leaned toward him, her own gaze steady. "That sounds incredibly lonely," she said quietly, "carrying all that weight, all those memories and decisions, with no one to share the burden, no one to remind you that you're more than the sum of your worst moments." He felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in walls built over centuries. This Omega girl, who'd known him only days, had just articulated the truth he'd never dared speak aloud. "Yes," he said, simply, It is lonely. Perhaps that's the real price of power. Not the responsibility or the difficult choices, but the isolation that comes from being unable to share yourself with anyone who understands. Mira reached out then, slowly, telegraphing her intention, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the chair arm. This time the vision that flowed between them was gentler, more controlled. She saw flashes of his long life, but not the battles and bloodshed the stories emphasized. Instead, she saw moments of quiet heroism that no one else knew about. The time he'd stayed awake for 3 days to personally tend wounded soldiers after a battle, refusing to let a single wolf die alone. The countless political marriages he'd refused over the centuries, unwilling to bind someone to him out of duty rather than genuine feeling. The schools he'd funded anonymously, the laws he'd changed gradually to protect the vulnerable, the way he'd personally hunted down and killed 3 separate alphas who'd been abusing their packs, asking nothing in return. She saw his grief too, the losses that had shaped him, lovers who'd aged and died while he remained unchanged, friends lost to war and time, the gradual realization that immortality was not a gift but a sentence, condemning him to watch everyone he cared about crumble into dust while he endured. The conscious decision, made nearly a century ago, to stop trying to connect with others, to embrace the isolation as a form of protection for his heart. Better to be alone than to endure another loss. Better to be feared than to risk caring and losing again. But now, looking at this girl whose hand was warm over his, Alaric felt those careful defenses beginning to crumble. When Mira withdrew her hand, there were tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for all of it. For the weight you carry. For the loneliness. For the way they've repaid your sacrifices with fear and isolation. You deserved better. You deserve better still." Alaric found himself reaching up to brush the tears from her cheek, his touch feather-light, marveling at how this small Omega had managed to see him, truly see him, in a way no one else ever had. "You're the first person in over a century to cry for me rather than because of me," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "That alone is a gift beyond measure." They sat like that for a long time, the ancient king and the fugitive Omega, connected by a understanding that transcended logic or reason. The third night arrived too quickly, bringing with it the knowledge that Mira's sanctuary would end with the dawn. She could ask to stay, as Alaric had offered, but they both knew that would only delay the inevitable confrontation with Cormac. The Clearwater Alpha would come eventually, demanding her return, and while Alaric could refuse, such a refusal risked war between packs. As powerful as he was, as legendary as his reputation, he could not simply ignore the political consequences of harboring another pack's Omega indefinitely. They discussed it over dinner in the Great Hall, Mira having insisted on cooking, the first meal the massive kitchen had produced in years. The normalcy of sharing food, of small domestic rituals, made the looming deadline even more painful. "I should leave before dawn," Mira said, pushing food around her plate. "Not because I want to, but because I won't be responsible for bringing conflict to your door. You've given me 3 nights of safety, a feeling like a person rather than a possession, and that's more than I had any right to hope for. I'll go north, toward the wild territories. Maybe I can find shelter among the lone wolves, the ones who've rejected pack structure entirely. It's not much of a plan, but it's better than staying and watching this place become a battlefield because of me." She tried to sound pragmatic, resigned, but her voice cracked slightly on the last word. The thought of leaving this fortress, of leaving him, hurt more than she wanted to admit. Alaric set down his fork with deliberate precision, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "No," he said flatly. Mira looked up, startled by the iron in his voice. "No, you will not leave," he continued. "Not because I'm commanding you, but because I'm asking you to trust that there are other options. You came to me invoking ancient law, but there are other ancient laws, other possibilities we haven't yet considered." He stood, beginning to pace, his mind clearly working through strategies. "If Cormac comes for you, and he will, I can challenge his claim legally. An Omega has the right to refuse a bond, even one arranged by family, if she can prove the Alpha in question is unsuitable. Your gifts, your oracle bloodline, that makes you a valuable member of our society beyond any individual pack. I can offer you a position here, official and protected, as my court seer. It would give you autonomy, protection, a purpose beyond running. She stared at him, hardly daring to hope. But wouldn't that just transfer the problem? Make me your responsibility rather than Cormac's possession? I don't want to trade one cage for another, even if yours has better accommodations. The words were blunt, but necessary. She needed him to understand that freedom mattered more to her than safety, that she would rather keep running than accept protection that came with invisible chains. Alaric stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully, his expression serious, but open. You would not be my possession, Mira. You would be your own person, free to leave whenever you chose, free to use or not use your gifts as you saw fit. The position would provide legal protection and a place to call home, but it would not bind you to me beyond professional respect and mutual benefit. I'm offering sanctuary that extends beyond 3 nights, not a different form of captivity. Before we see how Mira responds to this offer, and trust me, her answer will surprise you. I need you to do something for me. This story is building toward a confrontation that will test everything Alaric and Mira are beginning to feel for each other. If you want to see how an ancient king defends someone who's become more than just a refugee under his protection, then smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments whether you think Mira should stay or run. Your engagement keeps these stories coming, and the next chapter is going to be explosive. Mira stood slowly, her mind racing through the implications of his offer. She'd spent her entire life having decisions made for her, by her family, by her pack, by alphas who believed they had the right to dictate her future. Alaric was offering something different, something she'd never experienced before, a choice, freely given, with no manipulation or hidden agenda that she could detect. She walked around the table until she stood before him, having to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Why? She asked simply. Why offer this? You barely know me. I'm nobody, just an Omega with a strange gift and a talent for attracting trouble. What do you gain from protecting me? Alaric looked down at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. Because in 3 days, you've made this fortress feel less like a tomb and more like a home, he said quietly. Because when you look at me, you see a person rather than a legend or a monster. Because your gift showed you the worst parts of my history. And instead of running, you cried for me. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I'm not claiming any bond between us, not presuming any connection beyond what's naturally developed. But I am saying that you've reminded me what it feels like to not be alone, and that's precious enough to defend. If you choose to stay, it will be on your terms, with your freedom intact. And if you choose to leave, I'll provide you with resources and safe passage to wherever you wish to go. The decision is entirely yours. She searched his face, looking for any hint of deception or manipulation, and found only sincerity. This ancient king, this legendary warrior who could command armies and topple governments, was offering her something no one else ever had. Not ownership, not control, but partnership and protection freely given with no strings attached. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I'll stay, she said finally, not because I'm hiding from Cormac, but because I want to see what a life built on my own choices looks like, and because you're right. These 3 days have been the first time I've felt like myself, like I could breathe without constantly watching for threats. If you're willing to defend that, then I'm willing to trust you. The relief that crossed Alaric's features was visible, and Mira realized he'd genuinely been uncertain of her answer, had truly meant what he said about respecting her choice. He nodded once, formal and serious. Then it's decided. Tomorrow we'll begin the legal process of establishing your position formally. I'll send word to the council, inform them that Thornwood Fortress has a new resident, and that any challenges to your presence will be answered directly by me. He hesitated, then added more softly, "Thank you, Mira, for trusting me, for staying, for reminding me that isolation is a choice, not an inevitability." They spent the rest of the evening making practical plans, discussing what her role would entail, how they would present her position to other packs and the political landscape. It was all very reasonable and professional, but underneath the practical conversation ran an undercurrent of something neither was quite ready to name, an awareness of each other that went beyond logistics, a gravitational pull that seemed to strengthen with each passing hour. When Mira finally retired to the chambers Alaric had prepared for her, luxurious rooms in the eastern tower with views of the sunrise, she found herself touching the walls, the furniture, marveling at how quickly this place had begun to feel like home. In his own quarters, Alaric stood at his window looking out at the mountains, his ancient wolf stirring with something that felt dangerously like hope. Cormac arrived 3 days later, at the head of a contingent of 20 warriors, all wearing the blue and silver colors of Clearwater Pack. They rode up the mountain path, with the arrogance of those who believed their claim was righteous and their numbers intimidating. Alaric watched their approach from the battlements, Mira standing beside him despite his suggestion that she remain inside. She'd refused with a quiet stubbornness he was coming to recognize, insisting that she wouldn't hide from her past. Below, Cormac dismounted and looked up at the fortress with naked ambition. In his eyes, "So the rumors were true," he called out, his voice carrying easily. "The legendary Shadow King has been hiding away a stolen Omega. Return what belongs to Clearwater Pack, and we'll consider this unfortunate incident closed." Alaric's expression didn't change, but Mira felt the surge of his power, the air itself seeming to press down with the weight of his authority. "Nothing and no one belongs to Clearwater Pack that does not choose to be there," Alaric replied, his voice cold and absolute. "Mira Ashford invoked the right of sanctuary, which I granted. She has since chosen to remain under my protection as a free member of my household. Your claim is void, your presence here unwelcome. I suggest you return to your pack before you embarrass yourself further." The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke, and Cormac's face flushed with rage. But beneath the anger, Mira saw calculation. This alpha hadn't come just to demand her return. He'd come hoping for exactly this: confrontation. Cormac smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Your Majesty," he said, the title mocking. "You see, Mira's family formally agreed to our union. Contracts were signed, bride prices paid. By hiding her here, you're not protecting an Omega's choice. You're interfering in a legal arrangement between packs. That makes this a matter for the council to decide, not your personal judgment." He gestured to his warriors. "We're not here to fight. We're here to petition for a council hearing where all parties can present their case. Surely even the great Alaric Thornwood respects the law he claims to uphold." It was cleverly done, Mira realized with sinking dread. By framing her flight as a legal dispute rather than a rejected bond, Cormac had created a situation where Alaric couldn't simply dismiss him without appearing hypocritical. The council would have to hear the case, examine the contracts, make a ruling, and council proceedings could take months, during which her status would remain uncertain, her freedom conditional. Worse, if the council ruled in Cormac's favor, based on the legal agreements her father had made, even Alaric would be obligated to comply or risk being seen as a tyrant who placed his own wishes above the law. She'd escaped one trap only to find herself in another, more sophisticated snare. Alaric's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "Very well. I will inform the council that Clearwater Pack has requested a hearing regarding Mira Ashford's status. However, until that hearing concludes and a judgment is rendered, she remains under my protection within Thornwood Fortress. Any attempt to remove her before the council rules will be considered an act of aggression against my sovereignty and dealt with accordingly." He let that threat hang in the air for a moment. "You and your warriors may camp at the base of the mountain while messengers are sent. You will not approach the fortress again without explicit invitation. Am I clear?" Cormac's smile widened. "Perfectly clear, Your Majesty. We'll await the council's convenience." He remounted his horse, entirely too pleased with how this confrontation had unfolded, and led his warriors back down the path. Once they were gone, Alaric turned to Mira, his expression grim. "This is my fault. I should have anticipated that he would take this route. Should have had legal countermeasures in place before he arrived. Now we're bound by procedure. And while I'm confident we can win the case based on your right to refuse, the process itself will be stressful and invasive. They'll question you extensively about your reasons for leaving. Your family will likely testify against you. And Cormac will do everything he can to paint you as an irrational Omega who doesn't know her own mind." Mira felt her hands beginning to shake and forced them still. She'd known this wouldn't be easy, that choosing freedom would come with consequences. But hearing it laid out so starkly was still overwhelming. She took a deep breath, reaching for the courage that had carried her to this fortress in the first place. "Then we'll prepare," she said firmly. "I have my gifts, the Oracle's touch. I can use that to prove that my refusal was based on genuine knowledge of Cormac's character, not some emotional whim. If I can demonstrate to the Council what I saw in his memories, the cruelty he's hidden, they'll have to rule in my favor." Alaric looked at her with something like admiration. "Using your gifts openly like that will expose you, make you a target for every alpha who wants a seer under their control. Are you certain you're willing to pay that price?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm more willing to risk that than to let Cormac drag me back to Clearwater, at least this way. I'm fighting on my own terms." The next weeks were a flurry of preparation. Alaric called in favors from allies Mira hadn't known he possessed, wolves he'd helped over the centuries who owed him loyalty, if not affection. He hired the best legal advocates, wolves who specialized in pack law and individual rights. They worked with Mira for hours each day, helping her articulate her case, preparing her for the hostile questioning she would face. Alaric himself spent long nights in the library, researching precedents, looking for any legal angle that might strengthen their position. Slowly, a strategy emerged. They would argue that Oracle wolves, being so rare and valuable, could not be bound against their will, that their gifts made them assets to werewolf society as a whole, rather than property of individual packs. Through it all, the connection between Alaric and Mira deepened in ways neither had anticipated. The pressure of the impending trial brought them closer, their conversations growing more personal, more vulnerable. She told him about her childhood, about discovering her gifts and learning to hide them, about the slow suffocation of living in a pack that saw her as a tool rather than a person. He shared stories from his long life, not the famous battles, but the small moments that had shaped him, the loves he'd lost, the mistakes that still haunted him, the lonely weight of immortality. They began to move around each other with the unconscious synchronization of longtime partners, anticipating each other's needs, finding comfort in each other's presence. One evening, about a month after Cormac's arrival, they sat together in the library as had become their habit. Mira was curled in her favorite chair, and Alaric was nearby reviewing legal documents. The silence was comfortable until she spoke suddenly. "Can I ask you something personal?" He looked up, setting aside his papers. "Always." She hesitated, then pushed forward. "In 300 years, you must have cared for people, loved them even. Why did you never take a mate? Bind yourself to someone permanently? It's not uncommon for alphas to form bonds, especially those as powerful as you. What made you choose otherwise?" Alaric was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he set down his pen and turned to face her fully. "I did," he said simply. "Form a bond. Once, a very long time ago. Her name was Elena, and she was a beta warrior in my army, fierce and brave, and utterly without fear of me. We bonded during a campaign, one of those intense connections forged in the fire of shared danger. For 20 years, she was my partner in every way that mattered." He paused, pain flickering across his features. "And then she aged, as mortals do, while I remained unchanged. I watched her grow old, watched her body fail, held her hand as she died peacefully in her sleep at 63 years old. The grief nearly destroyed me. I swore then that I would never bind myself to someone again, never endure that particular agony of loving someone and knowing from the start that you'll have to watch them fade. Mira's heart ached for him, for the young king who'd learned the cruelest lesson about immortality. But that was centuries ago, she said gently. And you've been alone ever since? Never let yourself care for anyone? He nodded slowly. It seemed safer. Loneliness was painful, but it was a constant pain, manageable. Grief over losing someone you love. That's a pain that tears you apart from the inside. So yes, I chose isolation. Convinced myself it was wisdom rather than cowardice. She stood and crossed to where he sat, kneeling beside his chair so she could meet his eyes. At level. Can I tell you what I think? He nodded, curious. I think you've been so focused on protecting yourself from future pain that you've denied yourself centuries of potential joy. Yes, mortals age and die. But so do most wolves eventually. The time you have with someone matters more than how long that time lasts. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with infinite gentleness. When did you become so wise? She smiled slightly. Probably around the time of 300 year. Old King offered me sanctuary and reminded me that I was worth fighting for. We learn from each other, I think. He needs to understand that. What they were dancing around, the feelings growing between them, the pull that got stronger every day. Neither had spoken it aloud, both wary of complicating an already complex situation. But in that moment, with her green eyes locked on his golden ones, Alaric felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling. What if I'm not strong enough to survive losing? You, he asked quietly, voicing his deepest fear. What if opening my heart again just sets me up for another century of grief? Mira took his hand, her grip firm and warm. Then we'll have that conversation when the time comes, she said. But Alaric, you can't live your whole existence in fear of endings. That's not living at all. It's just existing, marking time, waiting for nothing. Whatever time we have, whether it's decades or centuries or just years, wouldn't it be better to spend it actually living rather than hiding? He looked at their joined hands, marveling at how this small omega had managed to articulate truths he'd spent lifetimes avoiding. You make it sound simple. She shook her head. It's not simple at all. It's terrifying. Believe me, I understand fear. But I also know that the best things in life usually are terrifying. That's how you know they matter. The council hearing was scheduled for the new moon, 2 months after Cormac's initial arrival. It would be held in Silver Peak City, neutral territory, in the great amphitheater where major pact disputes had been settled for generations. Alaric, Mira, and their legal team arrived the day before, taking rooms in the fortress that served as the council's headquarters. Cormac and his contingent were already there, along with Mira's family who had been summoned to testify. She saw her father across the courtyard and felt nothing but cold anger. He'd sold her without hesitation, and now he would stand before the council and try to justify that choice. She was done seeking his approval or forgiveness. The hearing itself was exactly as brutal as Alaric had warned. The amphitheater was packed with observers. Representatives from dozens of packs come to watch what many were calling the trial of the century. On one side sat the council, 7 elder alphas who served as judges in major disputes. Cormac presented his case first, his advocates arguing that Mira had been legally promised through contracts signed by her father as the head of her family unit. They presented the agreements, the bride price receipts, testimony from pack members about the propriety of the arrangement. They painted Mira as a confused young omega who didn't understand what was best for her, who needed the guidance of a strong alpha to reach her full potential. It was infuriating and degrading, and Mira forced herself to sit still and silent as her advocates had instructed. Then it was their turn. Alaric's legal team argued, brilliantly, citing precedents about individual autonomy, laws protecting omegas from forced bonds, the special status that should be afforded to oracle wolves. They called witnesses who testified to Cormac's cruelty, other wolves he'd abused who were brave enough to come forward. But the turning point came when Mira herself took the stand. She stood before the council, before hundreds of watching wolves, and spoke her truth. She explained her gifts, how she could see memories through touch. She described what she'd seen when she'd accidentally brushed Cormac during a pack gathering. The memories of him beating a previous partner, of him plotting to use her abilities to blackmail political rivals, of his plans to keep her isolated and controlled. Then she offered to demonstrate her gift, to let the council members themselves experience what she could do. Two of the elder alphas agreed, extending their hands. Mira touched them one at a time, showing them glimpses of their own memories, proving beyond doubt that her gift was real. The amphitheater fell silent, everyone understanding the implications. If her gift was genuine, then her knowledge of Cormac's character wasn't speculation or bias, but observed truth. Cormac stood, shouting objections, claiming she was manipulating what she showed, but the damage was done. The council members had experienced her gift firsthand and knew she wasn't lying. The deliberation took 3 hours. When the council returned, the head elder, A.O. Wolf named Magnus, who'd been serving for over a century, stood to deliver their judgment. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater, "This council finds that Mira Ashford's refusal of the proposed bond with Cormac of Clearwater was justified and rational. Her oracle gifts, which we have verified as genuine, provided her with legitimate knowledge of his unsuitability as a mate. Furthermore, we find that oracle wolves, being among the rarest and most valuable members of our society, cannot be bound through contractual obligation, but must choose their own paths." He looked directly at Mira. "Mira Ashford, you are hereby declared a free Omega, beholden to no pack save by your own choice. The contracts arranged by your family are void." The amphitheater erupted in noise, some cheering, others protesting. But Mira heard none of it. She felt only overwhelming relief, the weight of fear and uncertainty finally lifting. She was free, truly free. Not just running anymore, but legally protected, her autonomy recognized by the highest authority in their society. She looked to where Alaric sat and found him watching her with undisguised pride and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. Cormac stormed out of the amphitheater, his face twisted with rage, but he was surrounded by his own pack members, who were clearly eager to leave before their alpha embarrassed them further. Mira's father approached her, afterwards, trying to justify his actions, but she cut him off coldly. "You chose politics over your daughter. Live with that choice, but don't expect my forgiveness." That night, back at Thornwood Fortress, they celebrated quietly, just the two of them, as had become their way. Alaric opened a bottle of wine from his extensive cellars, something older than most countries, and they toasted to Mira's freedom. But as the evening wore on, the conversation turned serious. "Now what?" Mira asked. "I'm free. I have legal protection. I can go anywhere, do anything. The world is open in a way it never was before." She looked at him, her expression searching. "But I keep finding that the only place I want to be is here, with you. Is that crazy? To have fought so hard for freedom and then choose to stay?" Alaric set down his wine glass, his full attention on her. "It's not crazy," he said carefully. "But Mira, you need to be certain. You're young. You've only experienced a fraction of what life offers. I don't want you to stay here out of gratitude or because you haven't yet explored your options. You deserve to see the world, experience everything you've been denied." She shook her head, moving to stand before him. "I'm not staying out of gratitude. I'm staying because in the past 3 months, I've discovered that freedom isn't just about having options. It's about choosing what makes you happy. And this place, this fortress that everyone else fears, feels like home. You feel like home." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I'm falling in love with you, Alaric. Actually, I think I already have, and I need to know if that's something you can accept, or if your fear of loss is still too strong." For a long moment, Alaric simply looked at her, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of loneliness warring with present hope. Then he stood, taking her hands in his much larger ones. "I've been in love with you for weeks," he admitted, "possibly from the moment you touched my hand and saw my memories and didn't run. I've been terrified to acknowledge it, to let myself feel it fully. because the thought of eventually losing you makes me want to retreat back into isolation." He lifted one hand to cup her face, his touch reverent. "But you're right. Existing in fear of future pain isn't living. And whatever time we have, however long or short, I want to spend it with you. Really with you. Not holding back. Not protecting myself. You've taught me that love, even temporary love, is worth the risk." Mira turned her face into his palm, kissing his hand gently. "I can't promise you forever. I'm mortal. I'll age. Someday I'll die and leave you behind. That's the reality, and pretending otherwise would be cruel. But I can promise you that every day I have, I'll spend loving you as fully as I can. I'll fill this fortress with life and warmth. I'll challenge you when you need it, support you always, remind you that you're more than the legend." She met his eyes. "Is that enough? Can that be enough?" He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her small frame, marveling at how perfectly she fit there. "It's more than enough," he whispered against her hair. "It's everything." They sealed their promise with a kiss that was both tender and passionate. Centuries of loneliness meeting years of fear and transforming into something new. Neither spoke of bonds or formal matings yet. They both understood that what was growing between them was too precious to rush, that it deserved time to develop fully. But as they stood there in the firelight, holding each other, both felt the certainty of it. This was right. This was real. Whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together. The months that followed transformed Thornwood Fortress completely. Mira used her position as official court seer to establish a sanctuary for other wolves who found themselves in situations like hers. Omegas fleeing forced bonds, lone wolves seeking community, anyone who needed safety and autonomy. Alaric supported this completely, funding the operation and using his authority to protect their residents. The fortress, which had stood empty and feared for so long, became a symbol of hope instead. Wolves began to speak of Thornwood differently, not as the lair of a monster, but as a place where the vulnerable could find protection and the right to choose their own paths. Alaric found himself changing too, his isolation breaking down as more wolves came to the fortress. Mira helped him navigate social interactions, reminded him to soften his intimidating presence, showed him how to connect with others without losing his authority. He began attending council meetings in person rather than sending representatives, using his presence to push for reforms in pack law, advocating for greater Omega rights and more strict punishments for alphas who abused their power. The other council members were shocked by his sudden activism, but they couldn't deny his arguments or his power. Slowly, gradually, change began to spread through their society. 2 years after that first desperate night when Mira had knocked on his door, Alaric and Mira stood together in the fortress gardens, now carefully restored and blooming with life. She'd been working to cultivate the space, finding peace in making beautiful things grow. He'd helped when he could, learning about plants and growing seasons, discovering that creation could be as satisfying as the destruction he'd spent centuries perfecting. They'd settled into a rhythm of life together, not just lovers, but partners in every sense, building something meaningful that extended beyond just themselves. The sanctuary had helped dozens of wolves find new lives, and more came every month. Mira turned to him, the afternoon sun catching in her dark hair, and smiled with the kind of contentment that came from knowing exactly where she belonged. "I need to tell you something," she said, taking his hand. "I went to see a healer. Yesterday. Just a regular check because I've been feeling tired lately." She paused, letting the suspense build, her eyes dancing with joy. "Alaric, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a child." His reaction was everything she'd hoped for. Shock giving way to wonder, giving way to fierce protective joy. He pulled her close, careful despite his excitement, his hand moving to rest gently over her still flat stomach. "A child," he breathed. "Our child." The fear was there too. She could feel it in the slight tremor of his hands. A child would grow up, age, eventually die like all mortals, and he would remain. He would outlive not just Mira, but any children they had, any grandchildren, would watch generation after generation fade while he endured. It was the price of his immortality, the curse wrapped inside the blessing. But as he looked into Mira's eyes, he saw not pity for what he would endure, but joy for what they would experience together. This child would be loved, would grow up in a fortress. That was now a home, would know both parents fully. However much time they had would be enough because they would make it enough. I'm terrified, he admitted, of losing you both eventually, of the pain I know is coming someday. But I'm also more grateful than I can express. You've given me back my life, Mira. You've reminded me what it means to truly live rather than just exist. This child will be so loved, so protected, and I'll make sure they know their mother's courage and their father's devotion. She kissed him then, pouring all her love into it, and he responded with a gentleness that belied his legendary strength. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, and the promise of the future they were building together. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. Their daughter, Elena, named for Alaric's first love, grew up running through the fortress halls, fearless and bright. She inherited her mother's oracle gifts and her father's strength, becoming a bridge between the old ways and new possibilities. Mira continued her work with the sanctuary, eventually training other wolves to continue it so that it would outlast her own lifetime. Alaric used his long experience and renewed engagement to implement lasting reforms, changing laws that had stood for centuries, using his legendary status to protect the vulnerable rather than just inspire fear. As Mira aged, they faced those difficult conversations about mortality and loss. She made him promise that he would not retreat into isolation again after she was gone, that he would continue the work they'd started together, that he would let their daughter and eventually grandchildren be part of his life. It was hard, facing the reality of their different lifespans, but they faced it together, honestly, making the most of every moment they had. And when Mira eventually passed, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by family, and having lived a life of purpose and love, Alaric grieved as he knew he would. The pain was immense, tearing through him like a physical thing. But this time was different. This time he wasn't alone in his grief. Elena was there, now a grown woman with her own children, reminding him that Mira's legacy lived on. The sanctuary continued, helping new generations of wolves find freedom. The reforms he and Mira had pushed for had created lasting change in their society. And as he held his granddaughter, seeing Mira's eyes, looking up at him from a young face, Alaric understood what his love had been trying to teach him all along. Yes, mortals died. Yes, loss was inevitable. But the love they shared, the changes they made, the lives they touched, those things echoed forward through time. Immortality meant he would carry Mira with him always, not as a source of endless pain, but as a reminder of everything beautiful he'd experienced because he'd been brave enough to let her in. Decades later, when wolves spoke of Alaric Thornwood, the stories had changed. Yes, he was still the legendary warrior, the ancient king who'd ruled for centuries. But now they also told stories of the girl who'd knocked on his door during a storm and changed everything. They spoke of how the feared Shadow King had opened his fortress and his heart, how he'd become an advocate for the vulnerable, how he'd proved that power didn't have to mean isolation. And in the gardens of Thornwood Fortress, carefully tended by generation after generation of his family, there stood a memorial stone carved with words that captured everything Mira had taught him. Love is not diminished by ending. It is made precious by its temporality. Every moment is a gift. Choose to live them fully. And beneath, in smaller letters, Mira Ashford Thornwood, who taught a king how to be human again. If this story moved you, if Alaric and Mira's journey reminded you that love is worth the risk and that no one is too damaged or too old to change, then please let me know. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what resonated with you most. Stories like these exist because of your support, your engagement, your willingness to believe in transformative love. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you in the next tale.